Hey upcoming legends, welcome to the esoteric sim racing channel where for once we're going to talk about the bare basics. Getting into sim racing can be a daunting prospect. I know, because not too many years ago I was faced with the same challenges as you. Where do you begin? Will a controller be enough, or do you get an entry-level steering wheel? Which brand? Which simulator is best to get started with? So on and so forth. Join us in this new series as we break down the main components of getting into sim racing and quickly becoming an effective driver. We'll go over everything from getting you started through to quickly putting together competitive laps. Be sure to hit subscribe in order to stay up to date with the future parts of the series, where we'll be going over the ideal peripherals as well as driving and car setup fundamentals. Today, we're talking about the practical aspect of sim racing, namely, how to drive fast. Most of us think we have some idea of how to move quickly in a car, but the pursuit can be a lot more nuanced than we initially realize. It's not helped by the fact that most people are taught incorrect driving basics by their instructors when they learn to drive. So there's often a lot to unlearn before we move toward teaching ourselves how to handle the automobile like a race car driver. Basics. One of the fundamental things that most people are taught incorrectly is where to hold the steering wheel. Most road car drivers hold the wheel at 10 and 2 o'clock respectively. This is a best case scenario, with some moving even closer to the dreaded noon position. In most racing games, you will see the driver's hands rendered to sit near 9 and 3 o'clock on the steering wheel. This position primes you to account for whatever inputs may be required to deal with the situation presented to you. It allows the greatest freedom of motion to go toward full steering lock in either direction, and becomes absolutely critical when dealing with a low steering ratio such as 240 degrees, which is around about where high-end open-wheeler cars tend to sit. Training your arms to turn the wheel from this position is crucial in your ability to make the necessary micro-corrections to drive on the limit. When dealing with road car driving, drifting, or rally, this becomes less of a hard rule and more of a suggestion. When you're dealing with 540 to 900 degrees of steering lock, what tends to matter more than anything is your ability to throw the wheel around quickly, flick, and catch it if necessary. That said, you should always aim to make your default resting position around 9 and 3. It's worth pointing out now that this guide will largely focus on track driving rather than rally, as it's relevant to more people and contains information which tends to be very relevant to real-life tarmac driving. That said, we'll throw in a specific section on rally driving and drifting further into this video. One of our chief aims in track driving is to be as smooth as possible with our inputs. Broken inputs lead to an unsettled car, which leads to unpredictable behavior and lost lap times. And in a worst case scenario, a broken car. You should always aim to do the majority of your braking in a straight line, lifting only to help pivot the car into the apex of a turn, gently releasing the brake as you turn in the steering wheel. Once you pass the apex and get back on the throttle, your pedal input should be deliberate and gradual as you straighten out the steering wheel in tandem. You're practicing a sort of precision ballet with your body, the main difference being that the car's weight balance is a secondary layer of the performance, which you also have to manage. Speaking of braking, that's something you'll want to be doing with your left foot as much as possible in modern cars. Because most modern race cars don't feature a foot-operated clutch pedal, there's little need to reserve your left foot for a motion it will rarely, if ever, be going through. As a result, it's most efficient to reappropriate your left foot to braking duties. This allows you to save precious milliseconds over shifting your right foot across the two pedals. Left foot braking is something which all top-tier track drivers practice and use regularly. Racing line. One of the most fundamental elements to understand about race car driving is the racing line. The racing line refers to a geometric dissection of the track which represents the most efficient route through it for a given vehicle. While racing lines can vary depending on the type of vehicle you're driving, by and large, the majority of tracks have but one way through them, which is most efficient. As soon as you load up an unfamiliar track in a racing simulator, your very first goal should be to learn the racing line as quickly as possible. Any practice you do prior to this is almost entirely throwaway. You have to establish your route in order to learn what's possible and continually push the car that little bit further on each lap until you find that ever-elusive limit. Once the line becomes committed to your memory, you can then work on establishing muscle memory for the track and car combination. This is critical in order to facilitate you being able to execute the simultaneous inputs and considerations required for effective racing. The racing line will almost always have you maximizing the geometry of the track, cutting the inside apex as closely as possible while using all the runoff on the outside of the track when you exit a corner. There are of course exceptions for various situations, especially when you have to compromise a corner in order to maximize entry angle into another or exit speed out of yet another. These are the considerations you make on a case-by-case basis, and it's also where much of the fun trial and error of sim racing lies. Track markers. Once you've memorized the racing line, you can start pushing the boundaries to work out how late you can brake, how far you can turn in, and how fast you can accelerate around the track. One of the easiest and most repeatable ways to practice this is by using track markers. It's one of the reasons many racing circuits have boards on the side leading up to corners to let you know how far out you are. Did you have a fairly comfortable run through a turn while braking at the 100-meter board last lap? Well, maybe try braking at 75 meters this time and see how you go. Using visual markers is a handy way to both maintain reference points while still allowing you to push the limits. The markers don't have to be quite so obvious either. Maybe there's a mark on the tarmac at the braking point you've chosen. Maybe there's a service lane coming from the side of the track at your turn-in points, or perhaps some curbing denotes your point of action. On the Nürburgring Nordschleife, there's even a track marker denoted by an outdoor toilet. Track markers can range across anything from signs through to discolorations on the track, but you'd be best advised to use markers which have some level of permanence. For instance, cones and bollards are often knocked out in races. Track discoloration can be covered by rubber, and distance signs can be disintegrated by someone taking an ambitious lawnmower line while overtaking on the outside. Look to the apex. One of the most important considerations while driving is where you focus your eyes. We have a natural tendency to focus straight ahead when going at high speeds, which can be a good safety measure, but won't help you achieve quick lap times. Let's assume you're heading down a long straight, followed immediately by a hard hairpin, like you may encounter at Sebring or the Nürburgring. You're headed down the straightaway, looking directly ahead, perhaps checking your mirrors to see who's around and doing a quick status check on the car. You take note of your braking marker come up. On Sebring, that may be the second line across the track. You cross the line and brake hard. You now have a very few precious seconds to execute the corner correctly. The first thing you want to do with your eyes is shift them immediately to the inside apex of the corner. This allows you to mentally establish a three-dimensional relationship between your car and the corner. The other advantage is that you're staying true to the homage of look where you want to be going rather than where you are going. Because you're already slowing and likely turning into the corner, keeping your eyes on the apex will allow you to place the car as close to it as possible. Following on from this, once you cross the apex, your eyes should shift toward the runoff where you want to place the car coming out of the turn. Always practice looking where you want to place the car on the track. Some racing sims actually have an automatic look to apex feature which can help you practice doing this. Trail braking. Conventional wisdom dictates that you do all of your braking in a straight line, release the pedal, turn the car, and then accelerate through the corner. While this wisdom may be conventional, it's not particularly practical, nor is it wise, especially if you're chasing lap times. If there is a single point of this video where you remove all outside distractions and listen closely, let it be this one. Trail braking is the one technique which, in and of itself, is able to shave seconds off your lap time, if perfected. This isn't some nested clickbait statements, it's legitimately true and one of the most powerful techniques you can perfect as a race car driver. Once I personally learned how to do this, my Nordschleife times were cut down by almost half a minute. I then took this technique back to my favorite rally simulators and dominated all of my past stage times. Trail braking is fairly simple conceptually. The general gist is that while you're lining up for a corner, you aim to do the majority of your braking in a straight line, because this way all of the car's grip is geared toward the purpose of slowing you down. However, rather than slowing down to a point, lifting off the pedal completely and then turning in, what you instead do is brake a little later than you usually would, then begin to turn the car into the apex of the corner while gradually releasing the braking pedal. This way the steering wheel and brake pedal are being operated in tandem as part of our precision ballet. This way you're maximizing every tenth of a second, continuing to decelerate the car while turning into the corner, with the added bonus of increased turning traction on account of the brakes maintaining greater load over the front wheels. The net effect of all this? You get through the turn quicker. Your initial thought might be, turning while braking, isn't that a little dangerous? In a word, yes, it can be if you aren't practiced in it. If you brake too hard, putting too much load over the front wheels and turn too hard, the rear end of the car can get light and step out on you. You can spin the car if you don't have a feel for the technique. One of the added complications is that car setup factors massively into trail braking feel. Everything from aerodynamic balance through to brake bias, damper, wheel, and differential settings can affect this. As a result, trail braking is something that needs to be practiced consistently in order to become effective with it. Pair this with the initial discomfort of braking with the left foot, and the average road car driver has much to relearn before they're ready for track racing. One of the great things about trail braking is that it's something which can be practiced safely at low speeds in your road car whenever you're not actually sim racing. Accelerate out of the apex. One of the unspoken rules of race car driving is that most, if not all, acceleration should take place after the apex of a corner. This maxim may not be applicable to every single situation or type of car, but is still a great rule of thumb to adhere to by default. It ensures that not only you maximize your corner entry by trail braking all the way through to the apex, but that you maintain consistent car balance by gradually shifting from a state of deceleration to acceleration. One of the advantages of holding off on acceleration is that you prevent yourself from pushing the car into an understeer state through shifting the weight over the rear wheels during corner entry. Furthermore, it prevents you from upsetting the car balance by intermittently jabbing at the throttle through a corner. While the initial idea of not getting on the power early to go faster might seem contrary to your intuition, the sector and lap times will quickly reveal the truth of the situation. Weight transfer. Throughout the course of this video, you might have started gleaning pieces of a fundamental truth of racing, that it's all about managing the car's weight. The general ideas about shifting a car's weight around are fairly simple. If you accelerate heavily, you will shift the weight to the rear of the car, causing cars with softer suspension to squat into the rear wheels as they pull away. The more a car squats, the more understeer it's likely to exhibit in this state. Conversely, if you brake heavily, you shift a lot of weight over the front axle, causing the car to dive forward. This grip over the front axle can cause the rear end to get light, causing the car to rotate if unsettled. Meanwhile, turning left will load the right side of your car, while turning right will load the left side of your car. This is where tools such as suspension, dampers, and sway bars come into the equation. While this isn't a setup tutorial and we won't be getting into the function of these until our next video, it's worth bearing in mind that correct weight balance of the car is crucial not only to lap times, but the driver's overall sense of confidence. The rule of thumb for track racing is to keep all changes in weight balance gradual and predictable. We want to avoid upsetting the fine balance of the car as much as possible. As a result of this, we want to ensure our inputs are as smooth as possible, gradually lifting off the pedal as we trail brake, taking care to smoothly turn the wheel only to gradually return the wheel back to the center as we exit the corner and gently apply the throttle back out. If you see onboard footage of somebody seesawing the wheel, they're either deliberately pushing the car past the limit to have fun, or driving something that's remarkably unforgiving, which requires continuous micro-corrections in order to maintain its limit. Most over-engineered modern cars prefer smoother inputs. Heel and toe. Heel and toe is a manual transmission downshifting technique used to rev match between gears. If you're racing on the limit and you casually downshift the regular way by depressing the clutch, shifting down and releasing the clutch, you can upset the balance of the car by locking the rear wheels. Heel and toe is necessary when doing aggressive braking into corners because it matches the engine rotations to the transmission input. The approach to heel and toe involves 1. Pressing down the brake, 2. Pressing down the clutch, 3. Shifting the side or ball of your right foot over to quickly blip the throttle while the clutch is disengaged, 4. Shifting into the lower gear, and 5. Releasing the clutch. It should be said that this is only necessary on older manual transmissions, as modern paddle shifter cars automatically rev match for optimal results. You'll mostly be doing this when driving older road cars, older race cars, and when drifting. Rally driving and drifting. Continuing on from our section on weight transfer, this is something which viscerally ties into both rally and drifting. Rally driving foot cams can look like a tap dance because of the amount of input required of drivers. This type of driving becomes less about being smooth and more about averaging out the movements of the car to ultimately get it traveling where you want over loose surfaces. As a result, there is a lot of throttle jabbing and a lot of dabbing at the brakes with the left foot in order to continuously shift the weight around and keep the car moving where it should. There is less of a focus on the brake, apex, accelerate process, and more of an artistic intermingling of them. As such, rally driving tends to be some of the most fun and expressive driving one can do. While we can't do proper justice to all of the techniques employed in rally and drift driving, as they would require a whole video unto themselves, we can briefly talk about some of the main specifics of these driving styles. Handbrake turns. If you grew up around the 90s like I did, your Sundays would have been full of sports news segments showing you clips of rally car drivers like Colin McRae and Tommy Mackinnon pulling handbrake turns around tight, seemingly impossible hairpins on back roads in the middle of nowhere. The handbrake turn is one of the most defining aspects of rally driving. Broken down, the steps involve 1. Approaching a hairpin and decelerating rapidly. 2. Turning into the corner, depressing the clutch and flicking the handbrake to loosen up the rear end of the car. 3. Countersteering to catch the skid. 4. Accelerating while bringing the clutch out to catch the slide with the right amount of engine torque. 5. Balancing your way out of the turn in one smooth movement. As with all things, this is far easier said than done. The handbrake turn takes a lot of practice to get right, but when finally executed correctly, it will not only shave seconds off your stage times, but feel tremendously personally gratifying. Scandinavian Flick. The Scandinavian Flick is an old technique developed to put understeery rally cars into moderate speed slides and traverse corners that otherwise would require overslowing with standard driving or handbrake turns. It's also been adapted by some drifters who use the technique to put the car into a higher speed slide without necessarily needing a tremendous amount of horsepower to loosen up the rear end. Broken down, this technique involves 1. Approaching the corner and braking. 2. Turning away from the corner while keeping the brake depressed to load the car like a spring. 3. Turn into the corner while letting off the brake, causing the rear end to come undone and engaging a slide at high speed. 4. Balancing the steering and throttle to elegantly get through the corner. The Scandinavian Flick is an esoteric technique which isn't needed in most modern cars, but that doesn't mean it doesn't have value from time to time and is certainly a heck of a lot of fun to pull off. Clutch jabbing. This is a drifting technique used specifically to unsettle the rear of the car and send it into a slide. Very useful for low-powered cars that struggle to break traction. As the name would imply, it involves jabbing at the clutch while you turn into a corner to shoot a heap of torque through the rear wheels and send the car into a slide. You then countersteer and manage the throttle and steering to sustain the slide as one would in rally driving. Overtaking. I'll be the first to admit a distinct lack of expertise in this area. Coming from a rally driving and hot lapping background, my sense of racecraft is poorly developed to say the least. As a result, we'll be operating largely theoretically here and building up your knowledge of how to approach driving aggressively and defensively, which you can then practice and refine in your own time. The first thing we should lay out is that you should avoid at all costs doing unnecessary diving on the inside of a turn while screaming, "Senna!" Let's keep that stuff out of the public lobbies. There's a big difference between seeing a legitimate opening and going for it, as opposed to diving the inside constantly and jeopardizing everyone's race. One of the problems of sim racing is the lack of legitimate risk and consequence, which would prevent real-life drivers from going for questionable moves. Before making any rash moves, the first thing you want to do is take stock of the car in front of you. Try to discern weaknesses in both the driver and the car as soon as possible. Is he struggling with traction on corner exits? Is he braking early? What's the condition of his tyres? Where are his weak spots on the track? All of this is knowledge you can use to strategically set up your overtake and execute it swiftly and safely. Professional level overtakes are almost always set up in advance. It's very rare that they're opportunistic, even when they may appear that way to a layman. As a result, you should aim to be deliberate and plan your overtakes based on your performance to the car in front. For instance, if you're trailing a relatively speedy car throughout Sector 3 of the Nordschleife, but you're able to keep up, you should strategize to get them on the straightaway just before Tiergarten. Sector 3 is extremely narrow, windy, cambered and hilly, so an overtake on an evenly matched car there would be mutually assured destruction. But staying consistent and waiting to get the toe on the straight is a safe and assured way of getting the position. One of the safest ways to overtake is on back straights, using the car in front of you to break the wind resistance for you, then using this aerodynamic advantage to slingshot your way past them. This becomes doubly important and more strategic if you're racing in a class of car that has DRS. In closely matched races, the toe is the primary tool you have to even the odds. Rather than attempting risky moves which put everyone in a compromised position and continually hurting your overall lap time, you can instead just bide your time, save your tyres, make the overtake on the straight where you don't have to overheat the tyres and brakes, then be on your merry way. This becomes especially crucial if you're engaging in endurance racing events, where consistency and safeguarding the integrity of the car are far more important than heroics. Going for the standard overtake on the inside of a corner is a bit of an art form to do safely. You have to use good judgment to work out whether you're going to be in the sightlines of the car you're overtaking before committing to it. The famous crash between Senna and Prost in Suzuka is a great example of when these lines get blurred. You need to ensure the nose of the car is at least somewhere around parallel with the driver of the car in front so that they're able to see you and thus give you the space to make your moves safely. This is a grey area in sim racing because so many people are racing with single monitors using narrow FOVs. They're rarely able to see anything that isn't directly in front of their car. As such, overtaking incidents in sim racing are very, very, very common. Senna was a very aggressive overtaker, and Prost was tired of repeatedly ceding the inside line to him for the sake of safety. So coming up to the Suzuka incident, where Prost was guaranteed to win the championship if they crashed, he committed to his line, though some would say he turned in earlier than expected. Senna committed to his overtake, and thus they crashed. Part of this is a psychological game. You need to get a feel for whether the driver in front of you is timid or whether they will defend their line at all costs. If you dive on the inside of someone who will go through hell and high water to defend their position, it's essentially mutually assured destruction. While you should always strive to meticulously plan your overtakes based on your rival's weaknesses and certain advantageous track zones, occasionally, or relatively commonly if we're on public amateur sim racing lobbies, you will find your opponent making a mistake, which you can opportunistically use to your advantage. Maybe they messed up their braking zone and are going to shoot too deep into a corner, leaving you room to nestle in on the inside. Maybe they defended too aggressively on the inside, leaving you the wide line to cut across and get them on the corner exit. Seeing these moments and judging them correctly is all a byproduct of experience, so be sure to get out there and race as much as you can. If you're an experienced racer and very good with your judgment, then you can go for the dummy. The dummy involves coming up on your rival, then quickly diving to either their left or right. As soon as they commit to their defense, i.e. move over to block your line, you immediately switch over and take the side they've opened up. As you may infer, there comes a significant degree of risk with this move, especially in sim racing where viewing angles are often quite limited. That said, a well-executed dummy is one of the most satisfying moves to pull off in all of motor racing. Defensive driving. Defensive driving is almost entirely about the positioning of the car on the track. If you're defending a position from an opponent in a quicker car or one with fresher tyres, you can bet you're going to have to sacrifice your own lap times by defending the inside line in order to stop them taking your position. So, there are a few things you have the liberty to do when defending the position. You're not allowed to weave wildly to defend the position like a child might do in a go-kart. You're allowed to make one decisive move to dictate your defense, such as moving over to the inside line. However, if your opponent takes this opportunity to go wide, you can then gradually move back out and squeeze them to the edge of the track, thus compromising their line. So long as you don't actively run them off the track, it's all good. You're simply dictating the terms of the turn. The general gist is that you can't pull any surprises in the braking zone, because that's the point where both defender and attacker have to be fully committed to their moves. Once the brake lights go on, you can't do anything erratic. One strategy is to allow your attacker room to move past and overcook their corner entry. This takes some experience and strategic insight, but if you see them closing on your mirrors way too quickly and it looks like they're going to miss the braking zone, just give them the space. This way, it prevents the attacker rear-ending you, and assuming you've yielded the inside line, they will simply shoot on ahead with a shallow line into the corner. Meanwhile, you can simply take the ideal line and cut across their inside on corner exit and resume your leading position. Regarding when you have to move over and allow your overtaker some room is quite vague, and the accepted conduct tends to vary a bit between sim racing and real racing. Generally, if a substantial portion of their car is alongside your own, you cannot make any moves that will run them off the road. However, you can hold your line and compromise theirs, so long as you allow them just enough space on the road. To flip the attacking situation from before, where we talk about using toe on long straights to make passes, as a defender, it's well within your right to weave and break the toe your attacker has from your car. That said, this is another area where the rules are vague, and while you can move around to break the toe, you cannot weave wildly and disallow your attacker every passing opportunity. On the whole, your defense is predicated largely around positioning your car to most effectively compromise your attacker's line. On some tracks, this is far easier than others. Take Monaco, for instance, where it's taken for granted that the qualification dictates the outcome of the race. If you qualify in pole, you simply have to keep the car positioned in the center of the road, take your lines, and stay consistent. It's virtually a foregone conclusion you will win because the winding, narrow street circuit is almost impossible to pass on when flat out, unless there's a tremendous mechanical disparity between two cars or substantial skill differential between drivers. Well, there it is, our race driving primer. I hope this insight into race driving techniques has given you the building blocks to begin your journey into sim racing on the limit. As we've continually alluded to, driving quickly, consistently, and practicing good racecraft are a byproduct of much practice and experience, codifying a few very important techniques and knowing when to pull them out of your bag of tricks. Make sure to smash the subscribe and join us next time as we delve into the intricacies of the vast world of car setups. Once you master race car driving basics, the car setup becomes the next significant plateau to performing well. So in order to stay competitive, it's critical that you at least have a basic idea of how to set up your car to handle neutrally on each circuit. So until then, we'll see you next time.